In today's video, we're going to examine whether or not the depth of your softbox changes the spread of the light coming out of it. Let's start off with a little bit of housekeeping today. If you guys really enjoy learning from me on my YouTube channel, there's going to be a great opportunity in 2021, and that is to learn from me in person at workshops. And I'm so glad that I get to be able to travel around and do that again because I love meeting photographers and helping them on their journey. And I was able to do that a lot in 2018 and 2019. Of course, 2020 happened. And so this year in May, I'll be doing a workshop in Chicago. Then I'll be going to the New York City area in June. And then I'll be going to Portland, Oregon in July. So if you'd like more information and to sign up, you can go to johngress.com/workshops. So about today's video, I posted a video last year that was all about all the modifiers I use and why. And in there, I said that the Elinchrom Litemotiv 120, which is a 16-sided deep parabolic type softbox, was more directional than my other modifier, so I used it to control the light. And somebody started arguing with me that this wasn't true, and anecdotally, it seemed very true to me. That's the reason why I said it. So I decided to examine whether or not this was true or not. And I'll put a link to the video that I just mentioned up here. So basically what I decided to do was take 5 different softboxes and measure what the light meter reading was at different measurements. So I started off by basically placing a softbox in my studio at about, this high, eye level off the ground. And then I measured out on the floor every 2 feet in each direction. And that way I could figure out 2 feet from the face, what the light meter reading was, 2 feet from the face and 2 feet to the side, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, all of those things, if you will. And I'll go ahead and share a link in the description below that will take you right to the raw data in a XLS file. That way, in an Excel file or that sort of thing. That way you can see the results exactly. So I decided to test out the Elinchrom Deep Octa 100 centimeter or 39 inches because it's a modifier that I'm very fond of. Next, the Litemotiv 120, that's the 16-sided parabolic type softbox that I was talking about in the previous video. And then the deep white umbrella with a white cover that is 125 centimeters wide. And the reason why is that's the closest modifier that I have to the 100 centimeter Litemotiv. Unfortunately, Elinchrom doesn't make a shallow octabox that is 120 centimeters wide, but they do make one that's 135 centimeters wide. So I tested out the Rotolox 135 centimeter regular shallow octabox, if you will. And just for kicks, I also tested out the Elinchrom Indirect 190 centimeter giant octabox. And the reason why I chose that one is because I use it a lot of the time and I want to know operationally if that assumption I had was true about the Litemotiv 120 being more directional than the other ones. Now the reason why I'm making this video today is not to explain to you directly how the Elinchrom modifiers work. It's more so just to give you a general concept of whether or not the shape of the modifier does affect the beam and whether or not that really matters when you're in the studio. So let me go over all the data step by step. At each location, I recorded the light meter reading and f-stops. And then after the fact, I converted that to exposure value. An exposure value is just simply an arithmetic sort of number that gives us a whole number for each f-stop that goes up by 1 from one stop to the next. We don't have to deal with a system where we go from 2/8 to 4 to 5/6 and then 5/6 and 9/10, that sort of thing. So I converted everything to exposure value as if I were shooting available light at 1/250th of a second at ISO 100. And my input power into each modifier was at 125 watt seconds. I don't think any of that is really particularly useful. Just know that we're looking at numbers in exposure value. And as we go from 15.1 to 13.1, that is a 2-stop difference, just to make things very clear and simple. So once I started looking at the data, I began calculating the difference in exposure value from the center to the edge of the beam for each modifier at 4 different distances away from the modifier's face. So this first chart is based off of 9 light meter readings, 2 feet from the modifier, and then 2 feet to the left and right, 4 feet to the left and right, 6 feet to the left and right, and finally 8 feet to the left and right. These numbers are shown here as positive because they are representing the amount of fall off in EV as the light fades from the center to the sides. I wanted to present it this way so that I could create a visual graph that would sort of represent the shape of the beam of light. You can see right off the bat that the Deep Octa 100 is more directional than the other modifiers. However, the Litemotiv 120 takes over as you get out to 8 feet from center. Meanwhile, the Rotolux 135 centimeter regular shallow octabox here, as seen in yellow, pretty much is less directional, and there's a total difference in exposure of 1.3 stops at 8 feet off of center between the Rotolux and the Litemotiv 120. Then going on here to 4 feet from the modifier's face in distance on center, and then going off to the sides, you can see that the Litemotiv 120 is clearly more directional than all the other modifiers, and the Rotolux 135 is the least directional, and that difference is 0.9 stops. Now, I do think a lot of times our operating distance is going to be between 2 or 4 feet, so I think these numbers should be fairly useful. Now moving on to 6 feet, where the modifier is 6 feet away from our subject, and then going off to the sides here a little bit, you can see that the Litemotiv 120 is pretty much, again, more directional. The 135 is the least directional, and the others are falling in pretty much in the middle. Out there on the extreme edges, there's a difference of 0.8 f-stops, but as you come in to 6 feet, we're only looking at about a 0.2 f-stop difference. And now when we're 8 feet away from the modifier directly on center and then going off to the sides, we're looking at a situation where the Litemotiv 120 is pretty much also still most directional, and the 135 for the most part, most of the time, is the least directional, and the total difference as we're 8 feet from the modifier in both directions is a total of 0.5 stops, and the total difference when we're 6 feet to the side and 8 feet away is 0.2 stops. After looking at the graphs and the trend lines, you can see that the Litemotiv 120 is, of course, more directional than some of the other modifiers, and that the shallow Rotolux 135 is probably the least directional out of all the modifiers. So I wanted to see if this made a practical difference in the real world. So oftentimes when I'm in the studio, I have my subjects about 6 feet from the backdrop, and I get the light in on the side for Rembrandt lighting just about as close as I can, which turns out to be about 2.5 feet. I've measured everything out that you see here in this behind the scenes photo, and I've diagrammed it as well. So just know that we've got the face of the modifier, or I should say the side edge of the modifier's face lined up with the person's face. The bottom of the modifier is lined up with our model Sia's face. And so essentially, if we were to make a big circle, Sia would be located in the lower corner. And the reason for this is that this is how you're able to get that sort of Rembrandt lighting that comes across and creates that perfect nose shadow. So operationally, this is how I would usually place my lights. So again, the center of the light is about 8 feet from the backdrop. It's also about 2.5 to the side of the model, and the model's back is about 6 feet from the backdrop. So let's go ahead and look at each of our tests with the light coming from the side in this configuration. And since the previous graph showed that the 135 Rotolux shallow regular octabox was the least directional and the Litemotiv 120 was the most directional, I went ahead and just used those two modifiers for the following tests. So looking at this first test with the Litemotiv 120, the exposure on her face was f8 and 4/10, and the exposure on the background was f2 and 9/10, for a total difference of 3.6 stops. And that's why you see the background was much darker than the model. And I think this backdrop is pretty much sort of a medium tone. So let's go on now and look at the 135 centimeter Octa. And now looking at that, the exposure on her face was f8 and 2/10, and the exposure on the background was 2.8 exactly. The difference between the two is 3.2 stops. Now remember, the 120 was 3.6 stops. This difference is 0.4 f-stops. You would think this would be kind of noticeable, but as we look at the side-by-side of the two behind-the-scenes photos, they look kind of identical. I mean, sure, there are micro differences, but it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference. So let's go ahead and look at these two modifiers now where the model is 6 feet from the backdrop, and we'll change our backdrop color so it's a little bit lighter. That way you could figure out whether or not we're being confused by a darker backdrop. I just want to be fair overall. So starting off, we're looking at the Litemotiv 120, and the exposure on her face was f8 and 3/10. And the exposure on the background was 2.8 and 9/10. For a total difference of 2.4 f-stops. Now looking at the 135 centimeter Rodolux, the exposure on her face was f8 and 3/10, and the exposure on the background was 4.0 exactly, for a total difference of 2.3 stops. Now remember, the 120 was 2.4 stops, so we're only talking about a 0.1 stop difference here in a practical application. And as you can see, looking at these two images side by side, they basically look the same. So it really doesn't make that big of a difference. Now, to see whether or not this was noticeable, I went ahead and tried to do a head-on shot, where I placed the light pointed down at about 45 degrees, pointed directly at the model's face from 3 feet in front of her, and then she's 6 feet from the backdrop. Then I metered the light right in the middle of her face, and also at the top of the background, and then at the bottom of the background on this side over here. So when using the Litemotiv 120, the exposure on her face was f11 and 2/10. And the exposure at the top left-hand corner of the background, as we're looking at it, was f4 and 2/10. And the exposure at the bottom left corner of the backdrop was 2.8 and 6/10. So basically we're looking at a 3-stop difference, give or take. Then I went ahead and took the Rodolux 135 and put it in exactly the same position and measured with a measuring tape to make sure that we were 36 inches or about 1 meter from the center of her face to the center of the modifier. And this time, the exposure with the 135 was f11 and 1/10 on her face and 2.8 and 6/10 on the top left-hand corner of the backdrop, and 2.8 and 3/10 on the bottom left-hand corner of the background. So that difference is about 3.5 stops, and as you can see looking at the two images side by side from the 120 and the 135, they pretty much look the same. And even though it's a little bit of a difference, I don't really know that it necessarily matters. You know, looking at all of the test data, you can see that clearly the deep 120 centimeter parabolic type modifier is more directional than the shallow 135 centimeter modifier. You would think that operationally, when you get out there and you start using it, that it would make a difference, but from these sort of real world tests with our model, I don't really see that much of a difference. Now, Elinchrom doesn't market this modifier as being more directional. They don't make any claim of the sort. And this test today did not examine whether or not the light quality was different between the modifiers. I simply wanted to examine whether or not there was a difference in the overall exposure and directionality. So on paper, yes. In the real world, no. In the future, I'll make another video talking about the quality of light from the different modifiers, so don't take this video as that. Just take it simply about the beam spread. If you guys have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what your experiences are, whether or not you find that these modifiers are more directional. That would be great. As always, stay safe, wear your mask, call your mom, and I'll talk to you soon.